Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Este é o início da mensagem. Comece com energia total e um tom de comando, capturando a atenção imediatamente. The bench had been a single plank of wood rimed with frost, its iron arms cold enough to bite through gloved hands. Vanessa wrapped her coat tighter and watched breath make ghosts in the air, thinking of the long domestic silences that had settled over the apartment like dust after Derek left. Winter pressed against the river, against the bare branches, and it pressed against the inside of her too, the small, private places where hope used to be stored. She had come to the park because rooms at home felt too full of absence. A wedding band she had slipped off and left on the nightstand. The pile of infertility paperwork that had become a map of doors that would not open. A divorce decree that read like an answer to a question she had not been ready to ask. On the bench, she tried to be small, to carry the ache quietly, but grief had a way of echoing. If you want to follow Vanessa's journey, how a woman who felt barren and rejected finds a new kind of family, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens next. The cry started before she noticed the little shoes. High and urgent, it cut through the cold. Vanessa turned because she always turned, because someone else's sound felt like permission to move out of her own head. 3 children were tangled by the path, a strip of asphalt, a stroller overturned, a small boy on his knees with scraped palms, a pair of twin girls arguing about who had the red mitten. A man in a long coat was shoving a stroller into place and apologizing in that breathless way of someone whose hands had too many tasks and not enough time. He had an apology on his face that was not for the children, but for being late, for being in 2 places at once and never quite arriving at either. Vanessa found herself standing. She crossed the short distance without thinking and knelt beside the boy, ignoring the frost that had crept up her jeans. "Do you want to sit down?" she asked, not with the briskness of a stranger, but with the softness of someone who had once been held by a mother's hand in similar scrapes. The boy looked up at her, then at the man, then at the broken stroller. He did not speak. He was 10, tall for his age, jaw tight, in a way that suggested he had learned to keep his feelings tucked away. "You okay?" the man asked, voice threaded with something Vanessa could not name until she saw the photograph taped inside the stroller. A woman's smiling face, the kind that hurt you with how much it loved. She had the sense of being in someone's photograph rather than merely near someone. The air around the man was charged with it, as though he were carrying a small altar of memory in the pocket of his coat. "It's just a scratch," Vanessa said. "It'll sting for a little while. You want a bandage?" She reached into her tote and found a folded tissue, because habit was habit, and she always carried useful, awkward things.
Depois de pessoa a pessoa, mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental.
Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é um narrador, palestrante e autoritário. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. A frase anterior era "or a row of small shoes lined by the back door". Você está no meio de uma frase, pensamento, mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. He moved with the economy of someone who owned the right to be hurried. He apologized as often as he opened the refrigerator and had the look of someone who had become a stranger to the day-to-day rituals of parenting. For Vanessa, the first few weeks were comprised of small victories. She learned the children's routines. Which twin liked honey on her toast and which liked it plain? How Caleb liked his books stacked on the left side of the bed. How Trevor refused blankets that smelled of detergent more than the scent of human skin. She fixed 100 tiny breaches of domestic life, lost mittens, missing socks, the peril of a school permission slip forgotten in a backpack, and found that tending them was its own kind of repair. Meal times became rituals of nurture. Vanessa would stand at the stove while the family gathered, stirring something warm, and watch the light move across Brandon's profile as he tried to answer emails and then, at some invisible point, put his phone face down and look up. The children were the most complex part of the equation. Caleb, at 11, practiced an adult kind of reserve. He was tall and thin, with a face that could be bright and then shuddered. He watched Vanessa with the suspicion of someone guarding what remained of his family against the world's careless fingers. At night, he would sometimes wake and find her in the kitchen making herbal tea, and she would hand him a mug and listen while he reassembled his memories in a voice that trembled. "I thought I could have saved her," he said once, and Vanessa had no script for such a confession. She sat across from him and did what rarely felt like enough. She held a space where guilt could be named and where it could be answered with truth that did not blame him. "You were 7 when Lauren was sick," she said, choosing words like stones placed carefully. "You couldn't have done anything. Your mom loved you with all she had." It was not dramatic catharsis. It was patient, steady, adult reassurance that, over time, worked like the slow coaxing of a wound to close. The twins were different. Nadia dared the world. Natalie watched it and made small, wary translations. They could be fierce and tender in the same breath, a quality that taught Vanessa to laugh loudly and to quiet the house with story and craft. Trevor, 5, was a small weather pattern of need and affection. He attached himself to Vanessa with the immediate trust of a child who had missed consistent care. He would climb into her lap in quiet moments and press his face to her scarf, and she would breathe the scent of him and feel a protective ache that was not the same as motherhood, but close enough to sting. Brandon hovered at the edges of this reconstitution. He was a man who carried loss like a private injury. His love for Lauren lived in him in photographs and in the lullabies he hummed for Trevor, in the careful way he would place the twins' drawings on the pantry door. The days folded into weeks, and one afternoon, an ordinary one that began with the smell of cinnamon and spilled juice, Derek showed up at the gate. He was thinner than the last time Vanessa had seen him, and wore a face that had learned a new impertinence, the audacity of someone who had nothing to lose and thought that cruelty might be a currency. He had somehow found out where she lived and chosen that moment to arrive, perhaps intending to provoke, perhaps merely curious about the life he had walked away from. He said her name the way one tosses pebbles into a shallow pond and watches the ripples worry the surface. "You don't belong here," he said when Brandon opened the door. He said it to Vanessa and did not hide his pleasure in the sting. For a heartbeat, Vanessa felt an old familiar reaction, shame like a tight band. But something in the room steadied her. Brandon, who had been pouring a glass of water, looked at Derek as if assessing whether he was worth an answer. The children, Caleb especially, pressed close and watched. There can be a cruelty that wants to be witnessed, but there can also be a protective boundary that says no. Brandon's response was quiet and firm. "This is Vanessa's home as long as she wants it," he said. "You are not welcome to come here and make us smaller." There was a weight to his voice that Vanessa had not expected from a man who had been careful with words. Derek's mouth tightened. He left with a last look that was part threat and part pity. After the door closed, the house exhaled in small noises. A twin's giggle, a dog's bark from next door, the kettle clicking off. The encounter did not resolve anything. Vanessa filed the moment away as a necessary boundary, a clean line she would not cross back over. Yet its presence stirred something in Caleb. That night, as Vanessa tucked him in, he whispered, "What if he's right? What if you don't fit here?" He had all the softness of a child who had learned to measure acceptance by the smallest of gestures. "You fit," Vanessa said, sitting on the edge of the bed and leaning close enough that the lamplight softened the hard angles of his face. "You fit because you are part of this, because you are a son, because you are brave enough to live in the same house with your grief and keep being kind. That is what makes you belong." She said it not to flatter, but to plant something durable. Caleb listened as though she had handed him a seed. As winter gave way to a slower spring, the household's routines accumulated meaning. There was progress that felt like the upside of repetition. Trevor learned to tie his shoes, and Vanessa clapped in triumph. Natalie overcame a fear of the dark with a nightlight she chose herself, and Vanessa folded the blanket around her with exaggerated care. Brandon began to ask for help in the small domestic details that had once embarrassed him. "How do you keep the cutting board from staining?"
"How do you keep the cutting board from staining?" he would ask, and Vanessa would smile and show him the little ritual she'd grown into. There was a night when Brandon found her in the nursery, sitting in a rocking chair and tracing the loop of a mobile. The house was quiet. The children slept. The willow breathed outside like a slow green sea. He sat on the floor and watched her until she looked up. "Do you think about having your own children?" she asked, not unkindly, but with the curiosity of someone trying to enter an undisclosed room. She closed her eyes. For a moment, the old, tender grief came forward. Years of trying, of needles and failures, and conversations with doctors rendered sterile by medical language she had once found too clinical and too precise. She had wanted babies once in a way that had been part of her arrangement with the future. The diagnosis had felt like a betrayal delivered without preface. "I thought so," she said, choosing her words. "I thought I would. But things happen." She did not offer him the raw detail of the clinic or the exact tally of losses. She offered instead the truth of the absence. Brandon listened as if the confession were precious. "And does it hurt?" he asked. "It does," she said, "but I have learned to find meaning in the middle of what's left." It was an answer that held both sorrow and a kind of hardy, quiet hope. Brandon reached out and put a hand on hers, a gesture that felt like the first step into something neither of them wanted to name too quickly. Their closeness grew not as a sudden conflagration, but as a series of small, consented gestures. A hand that lingered on the kitchen counter when he gave her a recipe. A shared look across a table while the children argued about marbles. Coffee poured for her just a little too full in the mornings when she lingered over a second cup. The house learned that there could be a tenderness that did not displace Lauren's memory, but that complemented it, as if two different kinds of love could occupy the same room without erasing one another. Vanessa found herself teaching Caleb how to carve a small wooden whistle. It was a ridiculous thing, a tiny project brought home from a hardware store where the clerk had smiled like someone knowing the weight of life's small tasks. The first try was lumpy. The second whistle squealed more like a duck than a bird. On the third, it made a clear, bright sound that made Caleb grin in a way that softened Vanessa's chest. "You taught me to be patient," he told her, and she realized that in teaching him to make the whistle, she had been teaching herself a new patience with the unfinished parts of her life. But peace, when it arrives, is never immune to the world's unpredictability. One late afternoon, a routine grocery trip ended with a text that was small and ordinary in tone and enormous in consequence. "Bring Trevor in now. He has a fever and is complaining of sharp pain," the pediatrician wrote after a rushed phone call. Vanessa remembered the way Brandon's face went still. A man whose decision-making skills moved now from spreadsheets to the small, urgent calculus of a sick child. She packed a bag with the ease of someone who had been in hospital corridors before, though never in the way she would be now, as a near parent, as a person responsible for another human being's fragile body. The emergency room had a smell that was both antiseptic and of waiting, an odor that sat on your tongue like a thin salt. Vanessa sat in a chair outside Trevor's room, with her hands clasped around her coat collar, and felt the room lamplight make her palms look paler. She prayed once, quietly, the sort of whispered plea that is its own kind of apology and petition blended into one. Brandon paced the corridor, phone clutched, while Caleb sat near the vending machine with headphones on but not listening, trying on a stoicism that was still young enough to crack. When the surgeon emerged, it was midday lateness and the tiredness of someone who had been awake a long time. "It was appendicitis," he said. "We performed surgery. It was urgent but successful. He's in recovery." Relief arrived in that clinical register, warm and factual. Brandon let out a sound that was neither laugh nor sob. Vanessa felt something loose inside her that she had been holding for months, tense as a muscle. They spent the night in a family room, smelling faintly of coffee and fluorescent lights. Trevor slept, small and pale, and Vanessa watched the rise and fall of his chest until her lids drooped. In the quiet hours, Brandon sat beside her, open-handed, in a way that made confession possible. "I am scared," he said finally. "I've been so afraid of being replaced by my grief. I thought I could manage it alone, but I couldn't always be with them. I wasn't ready to learn how to be present." He did not look at her when he said it. Instead, he watched Trevor through the hospital window. "You stepped in, and you stayed." Vanessa felt her throat tighten. All the ways she had worn herself small, the divorce, the diagnosis, the quiet rooms, suddenly rearranged themselves into a fragile architecture of something new. "You were present in the way you could be," she told him, "and you let me be present in the way I could." It was an answer that named their different modes of love and partnered them. In the days after Trevor's surgery, the household took on a renewed rhythm of gratitude. Small gestures multiplied. Neighbors dropped off soup. The twins made get-well cards with glitter that could not entirely be contained. Caleb started attending therapy with the slow diligence of someone learning new muscles. Vanessa's role as caregiver had shifted into something less transactional and more chosen.
She was no longer merely filling a vacancy, but participating in the recreation of a family. Derek's shadow remained a distant nuisance. He called once, his voice brittle, asking for trivial information about a bill he had no right to see. Vanessa did not answer. She had learned to let certain things go, like letting a branch fall. Her own life, meanwhile, began to take shape in unexpected ways. She took a part-time job teaching a cooking class at the community center, because cooking had become her language of care, and she liked the way people's faces changed when they learned to make something that lasted. She found herself telling students about recipes with the kind of storytelling that felt like memory exchange. It was small and honest work, a scaffold for her identity that did not rely on marriage or motherhood as its definition. The garden bench behind the house became their unofficial confessional and sanctuary. One warm evening in late spring, after the adrenal dullness of Trevor's recovery had eased, Brandon led Vanessa there. The willow shaded them. Light filtered in green. He had in his hand a small ring box, not ostentatious, but chosen with a certain care that made it more intimate. "Vanessa," he said, and his voice had the steady patience of a man who had learned to name things without rushing them. "You came here when you needed a place to rest. You did not ask for anything, and you gave everything. The children love you. I love you. I want us to be family, not because it will fill every absence, but because I have seen what you do with other people's pain. Will you marry me?" Her first response was sound rather than words, the kind of exhale that released months of held breath. She thought of the bench at the park, of the cold that had once pressed against her coat, of the way children's cries had pulled her from her private grief and opened a door she had not known to knock on. She thought, too, of the battered paperwork that had once felt like her story's edges. She said yes. They planned a small wedding in the garden, with the willow watching like a gentle witness. Friends and neighbors arrived, carrying casseroles, and a sense that joy was not an erasure of sorrow, but its brave companion. Caleb stood beside his father as best man, with a whistle Vanessa had helped him carve, wrapped in a ribbon for luck. The twins made flower crowns that fell lopsided and perfect. Trevor toddled in with a crumb-stained shirt and an expression that was all confidence, because he believed wholeheartedly this day was right. Vanessa walked down the simple aisle to a place where everyone waited with kindly eyes. She did not pretend that grief was gone. Lauren's photograph sat near the altar, and was greeted with a moment of gentle silence that felt, again, like an honest blessing. The vow exchange was intimate and honest, promises to show up, to care, to listen, to let the past live in memory without ruling the present. There was laughter, there were tears that cleansed rather than drowned. When Brandon slipped the ring onto her finger, it fit like a quiet promise. Years moved on. Vanessa's life did not become a fairy tale, because life rarely bends to pure myth. There were small tragedies, sick days, disappointments at work, a season when Caleb needed more therapy, and the twins argued endlessly over who had eaten the last cookie. There were also the quiet, steady pleasures of routine and seasonal rituals, pancakes on rainy Saturdays, a family photo taken in front of the willow every year, Vanessa teaching a cooking class that overflowed with students and recipes, and the kind of laughter that is good for the soul.
She published a small cookbook with recipes that smelled like memory, and the proceeds supported the community center's childcare program, an act she called modestly a way to give back. Derek left town for good after one last attempt at contact that Brandon intercepted. It was a small closure that came not with drama, but with the simple fact of him not being there anymore. Caleb graduated from middle school with a speech that mentioned his mother and thanked the people who had not given up on him. The twins began to argue about who would inherit what family recipe, a debate that produced laughter and a mild flour war. Trevor, now older, learned to ride a bike without training wheels and wanted, occasionally, to be picked up and swung until his laughter made the willow leaves tremble. Vanessa's infertility never stopped being a part of her story. She and Brandon discussed adoption quietly and with caution, and once they fostered a little girl for a brief, beautiful summer before she returned to a birth family who had found their footing. That experience taught them both the breadth of love, that it was possible to grieve a child you never had in a way that did not diminish the children you did love. Vanessa's identity remained complex. She was wife, caregiver, teacher, and woman who had been changed by absence as much as by presence. On an ordinary autumn afternoon years later, they celebrated a small, private vow renewal by the willow. The children, now taller, more adult in some ways, and stubbornly childish in others, stood around with arms linked. Caleb looked at Vanessa with a steadiness that came from healing and practice. He put his hand on the carved whistle and said, "You were right about patience." Nadia and Natalie made ridiculous crowns again. Trevor recited a poem he had learned in school about how families are not only what you are born into, but what you choose to make. Vanessa traced the name of the park bench that had started it all in the margin of her cookbook as an aside. A line that read, in her handwriting, like a small benediction, "Sit when you are cold. Someone may come with soup." She kept the bench as a memory, not a relic. It reminded her that being chosen was different than being given, and that chosen love could be loud and messy and huge in its ordinary repetitions.
Firefighters worked in choreography Vanessa had only seen in newsreels. Hoses arced, men and women in heavy coats moved like dancers, and the sound of their radios stitched over the muffled conversations of neighbors. Noor met her on the sidewalk with her hands in the pockets of her jacket, the pale streak of ash across one cheek. "It started in the kitchen," Noor said. Her words were clipped like she was trying to keep a single rhythm. "Someone downstairs, heater, maybe. It spread fast." "Is anyone hurt?" Vanessa asked, though she could see the answer in the way the volunteers clustered outside. A handful of small figures sat on the grass with blankets. A woman with a child's hand hugged herself as if heat had nothing to do with what she felt. "No, the kids were at rehearsal," Noor said. "The storage room, Brandon's office, smoke damage. We don't know about the records and the cookbooks. I'm sorry, Vanessa. I'm so sorry." Brandon arrived with soot under the rims of his hair and eyes already bright. He moved toward her and took her hands in both of his. The contact was immediate and grounding, the same simple steadiness that had been there through losses and small daily rebellions. They stood close together like two people who had learned long ago to make their center where they were standing. "It could have been worse," he said. He kept his voice even as he scanned the building. "They've got it mostly out now, but the back wing, recipes, workshops, the little pantry, they lost most of it." Inside the police tape, a firefighter handed Vanessa a paper cup of coffee as if she were a friend he'd known for years. Outside, neighbors offered blankets and clumsy prayers.
The children who had been at the center, those in the after-school program, clustered by the van, sticky with ice cream, and relieved in the raw way of small survivors. Trevor, finally fetched from his friend, hugged his mother like a child who knew precisely how to measure fear into safety. The next day, the town woke as a town that had been touched by a storm. Streets were the same, shops opened, but the center was a charred hole of what it had been, a rawness in the center of the neighborhood you could smell on the wind. People came by with casseroles and offers, money, time, a vanload of shelving. Vanessa walked through the open door with Noor and a volunteer from the kitchen, and the sight of the blackened tiles and ruined boxes of community records felt larger than the loss of objects. It felt like an assault on the memory of small, ordinary things they had built. There were formal steps to take: insurance adjusters, reports, inventories. But the first and loudest conversation was smaller and urgent. "We could hold the fundraiser in the park," Noor said, hands spread. "Put up tents, have a cook-off, bring the kids, raise money for repairs and new supplies." "Vanessa," Brandon said.
"Vanessa," Brandon said, "we need to make sure the children who come to the pantry and the after-school program don't go hungry while the center is closed. We should set up a drop at the church hall." It was in that round of practical decisions that Vanessa felt the old pattern of repair settle into place. She began making lists: who would do what, who could drive a van of supplies. She called the printers about the remaining copies of her cookbook. They had been stored in the back office and were ruined, their binding fused black with heat. She thought, with a terrible, domestic grief, of pages that had smelled of basil and lemon and the names of students she had written in the margins. But grief curdled quickly into action. "We'll reprint," she said. "We'll just reprint and do a special edition, proceeds to the center. We'll put the dedication on the first page, for those who bring soup." The town's response surprised none of them, and surprised them all. The next week became a frenzy of good intentions and clumsy competence. The local paper ran a photograph of the burned doorway with the headline, "Community Rises." Someone created a crowdfunding page that snowballed into donations from people who said they remembered the center from childhood. Former foster families, parents of kids who'd learned to read there, teenagers who had found an internship through Vanessa's class. Each message was a small sermon on the work they had all done together. Vanessa found herself traveling a strange terrain of gratitude and dread. There were moments she felt as if she were standing on the riverbank, watching the current carry away a piece of her life. And other moments she was buoyed by the knowledge that everything worth saving was not inside the building. "You have to remember," Noor said to her one evening as they folded paper lanterns, "it's not the bricks, it's what we keep bringing back." They organized a benefit, a meal in the park, under the willow. Tents were strung with lights made out of mason jars. Tables groaned beneath the weight of casseroles and pies. Children painted signs that read, "We love our center." Vanessa cooked with an energy that was almost devotional. She oversaw a parade of neighbor cooks, stews that had been handed down, salads that gleamed like jewels, breads scorched on the bottom but warm on the inside. There was a kind of holiness in the clatter of plates and the low, continuous hum of conversation. The night of the fundraiser, the willow above the brook stirred, as if in understanding. Brandon stood near the band, his face shadowed in the light, watching the way people moved together. Caleb came with a manuscript for a speech, and found with no surprise that he read from his heart rather than from papers. He spoke of the center as a place that had taught him the shape of generosity. "They taught me to measure success by what you give away,"
he said, and the audience, who had once watched him cross town in a t-shirt too small, applauded as if they were applauding a hymn. The twins, sticky with lemonade and flour from the bake sale, took turns crowning Vanessa with their impossible paper crowns. Trevor ran down the hill and launched himself into Brandon's arms with the sort of abandon that made the crowd laugh. People who had been customers at Vanessa's classes now apologized for not offering help sooner. Teenagers who had once been drawn into the center's video classes had become volunteers, and they lifted chairs and distributed plates with the sort of competence that comes from being trusted. There were quieter moments among the bustle. Vanessa standing at the edge of the tent with a cup of tea and watching the people. A list of names humming in the back of her mind, people she could call and would answer. A woman she had known only as Mrs. Lopez hugged her and, through tears, told Vanessa how the pantry had meant they did not have to choose between medication and food one winter. It was the kind of confession that left a small, heavy gratitude in Vanessa's chest. By the end of the night, they'd raised more than enough for initial repairs. An anonymous donor, someone who had seen Vanessa in the paper years ago when the cookbook first appeared and never forgotten the line about the bench, offered to cover the rest of the rebuilding on condition that the center remain free for the neighborhood. Vanessa accepted without hesitation. The donor was brief in their letter. Keep the soup warm. Vanessa kept the letter tucked into the margins of the ledger she kept for the center. The rebuild took months. They painted the rooms in colors chosen by the children. Mint green for the reading room, soft yellow for the kitchen. Volunteers whose names had been attached to casseroles and signage came back with paintbrushes and hammers. Vanessa oversaw the kitchen like a conductor, assigning spaces and naming shelves. They printed a new edition of the cookbook, this time with a foreword by Caleb and a small line on the inside cover, "For anyone who has been warmed by a neighbor's hand." It sold steadily and quietly funded not just the physical rebuild, but new programs. Saturday tutoring, a music corner, a small fund for kids who needed shoes. In the slow silver of those months, Vanessa found other things shifting. The twins apprenticed for a summer with a pastry chef in the city and came back with flour still under their nails and a seriousness that Vanessa laughed. Trevor discovered an obsession with tiny mechanical things, a love of disassembling and reassembling, and spent afternoons in Brandon's garage learning the names of engines. Caleb moved into his first apartment and pushed boxes across town with two friends and a playlist that made them sing in the stairwell. Vanessa's infertility, always a quiet companion, continued to shape her interior landscape. She and Brandon kept talking about adoption sometimes, but the conversation was no longer heavy with longing. It was practical, soft, threaded with the certainty that parenting was many shapes. Sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet and the river answered the moon, Vanessa would imagine the child they might someday know, a child who would run under the willow. And the image no longer made her ache in the old way. It simply settled in as another shape her life could take. Years moved in the ordinary increments of bus stops and birthday cakes. The center held its first open house after the rebuild, and the bench that had started the whole story, its wood sanded and oiled, sat in a corner under the eaves, a quiet testament to endurance. People who had once been dependent on the pantry now taught classes, sewing, financial planning, the kind of practical skill that returns dignity. The twins organized a bake sale that learned to donate a portion each month. Trevor organized a tinkering club for kids who liked to take apart radios and put them back together again. Vanessa taught a class called Soup and Story, where neighbors came with recipes and memories.
One autumn, when the leaves were beginning to bruise gold, a woman arrived at the center holding a mismatched handbag and a paper cup with a lid. She looked older than Vanessa would have expected, and a little tired in the way that a life of too many miles tends to make people look. Vanessa noticed her at once, the way she kept glancing at the kitchen as if measuring the heat, and when she approached the counter to ask about the soup schedule, Vanessa recognized the line of a name in her face. It was the little girl's face from the summer they'd fostered a handful of years ago, the girl who had returned to her birth family and who had become a small, bright patch in Vanessa's memory. "Do you remember me?" the woman asked when Vanessa took her hand. Vanessa did not reply outright. She let the silence stretch into a bridge. It was the shape of grief and also of possibility. The woman smiled, and in that smile Vanessa read 1,000 small reconciliations. "I was here that summer," she said. "My name is Rose. I wanted to thank you for a lot of reasons, for teaching me how to measure spices and not fear the smoke, for the way you made a room where I could sit at a table and not have to be brave all the time." Rose started coming in the following weeks, first to volunteer, then to lead a class on mending clothes. She had learned to sew from her grandmother and had a gentle, exacting way of moving through a room. One evening she brought a loaf of bread and a story of the house she had returned to, the way her mother now kept a job, and that they had a small garden. "I can't pay much," she said, cheeks rosy, "but I can teach the kids to darn their socks."
Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é narrador, palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era: "But I can teach the kids to darn their socks." Você está no meio de uma frase, pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. ênfase. For Vanessa, the encounter with Rose was like the quiet return of a tide she had thought had receded forever. It was not the restoration of what was missing in the ways she had imagined as younger. It was a new, luminous iteration of connection. Rose's presence in the center was a circle closing in the most human sense. Someone who had once been nourished by the community, now returning to offer the same. There were other returns too. People who had moved away came back for anniversaries and reunions. A woman who had been a college student in Vanessa's cooking class came decades later with her own toddler and asked if Vanessa remembered a soup that had saved her when she'd had no money. Vanessa smiled and took the child's hand. She remembered the girl as she'd been, hungry, keen, unstoppable, and in the child's small fingers she felt the continuity of what had been passed down. It would be easy to say that everything smoothed into complacency after the rebuilding, that the center hummed forever and each problem was solved with a casserole. It would be a lie. There were always problems. A grant that fell through, a heater that quit in the dead of winter, a volunteer who left in disappointment. There were nights when the twins fought over a recipe book, like the world they had been given to steward was small enough to argue over. Brandon had health scares that required hospital visits and long evenings of waiting in antiseptic lamps. Sometimes Brandon's father reappeared in the edges of their lives with requests that dug up old grudges. The pattern always remained, though. Things would need fixing. The family would fix them, and the center would go on. One spring, when the willow was hung with the promised strands of lanterns, and the river that had reflected so many seasons ran clear and insistently forward, Vanessa sat on the bench by herself and traced her fingers over the worn groove where the whistle had once been carved. The bench smelled faintly of resin and rain. She thought, with a mild astonishment, of the way the bench had started the entire narrative of her life here. The small act of sitting and being noticed. She had learned over the years that being noticed did not obligate one to respond with grand gestures. Often the answer was soup, or a repaired dress, or a patiently baked loaf. Caleb came up behind her, slowed, and wrapped an arm around her shoulders in the old easy way of sons who had moved into gentler steadiness. He had a small envelope in his hand. "I wrote something," he said, "for the next edition, for the center, for you." Vanessa laughed. "You always have to make it official." "Does it need to be official to be true?" he asked. But he handed over the envelope anyway. Inside was a short piece he'd written, less a dedication than a memory. "She taught me patience not as a virtue but as an action. The waiting, the stirring, the commitment to come back." Vanessa read it twice, then put the paper in her pocket.
The bench creaked under them as Trevor, the twins, and Brandon joined, with Trevor carrying a small robot he'd built, and the twins arguing over who would have the first slice of pie. The sun fell soft across the river. For a long time they sat together without speaking, as if the presence of one another was a kind of prayer. At one point, a little girl with sticky hair and a freckle on her nose ran up and dropped a folded paper crown into Vanessa's lap. "For you," she said solemnly, "because you give us soup." Vanessa accepted the crown and put it on, and the children whooped as if a coronation had occurred. The bench was their court and their sanctuary. People drifted by, neighbors, volunteers, friends, and called out, told little stories. A man thanked Vanessa for teaching his wife how to dice an onion without crying. A woman asked about the next sewing class. The ordinary flow of daily life swept and folded around those small moments like a quiet river. That night, as the family returned home, Vanessa walked through the house and paused in the kitchen where she had measured, stirred, taught, and mourned. She opened the drawer where she'd once kept the whistle's scrap of wood, but there was nothing left but a small thing she'd forgotten she owned. A photograph of the bench, taken the October morning they'd first met, when the frost had rimmed the edges of the world, and everything seemed fragile and new. She pressed her thumb against the glossy surface and felt, for the first time in a long while, the uncomplicated contentment that comes from the sense of a life made well. She sat at the table with a notepad and, without thinking too hard, began to write. Recipes, of course, but also a list of people to call, a menu for the next community dinner, a note to Rose to bring her sewing kit on Thursday. The pen moved like someone who had been given back a way of doing things. When she paused, Brandon leaned back in the doorway with his coffee and said, "You look like you used to when you were making the first batch for the class." "I used to think one batch could change everything," Vanessa said. "Now I know it's 1,000 batches." Their laughter filled the kitchen, a small, necessary chorus. Outside, the willow whispered in the dark, and someone, somewhere, set a pot on the stove. The house was full of ordinary noises, cups clinking, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft, steady breathing of people who chose each other. Vanessa closed her notebook and slid it into the drawer where she kept the letters from donors and the margin notes of recipes. She did not believe in tidy endings. She believed in the work of return and keep returning. She believed in acting when a bell rang, in answering the phone, in putting a hand on the shoulder of someone who needed steadiness. When sleep finally found her, it arrived like a benediction, quiet, unimposing, faithful.